you all to the second keynote talk of the Financial History Network webinar, an initiative that started in September of this year and that has been actually much more successful than we ever thought it would be. We have the honor and pleasure to have with us Professor Carlos Marichal. Carlos Marichal is a professor emeritus in Latin American history at El Colegio de México, a leading public research university in Mexico. He's a specialist in the economic history of Mexico and Latin America. He is the author of several books, including A Century of Debt Crisis in Latin America, Bankruptcy of Empire, A History of Global Financial Crisis, Nueva Historia de las Grandes Crisis Financieras, Historia Mínima de la Deuda Externa de América Latina, and most recently, a book on the emergence of banks in Latin America, on which this keynote talk is sort of based. He has also published many books on intellectual history, international relations, and business history. Professor Marichal has been a member of the editorial boards of journals such as Financial History Review and the Journal of Iberian and Latin American Economic History and America Latina en la Historia Económica. He's an enthusiastic promoter of digital history initiatives, including H Bancaria, a website on the banking and financial history of Spain and Latin America. He has been a visiting professor in prestigious universities around the world. He is a founding member and a former president of the Mexican Economic History Association. He is a member of the Mexican National System of Researchers at the Emeritus level, and he also was a recipient of Mexico's National Prize in Arts and Sciences in 2012. He became an international honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019. And moreover, he is a very well appreciated colleague and friend. So today, Carlos Marichal will give a talk on the emergence of banks in Latin America, 1850, 1873. Was there a financial revolution or something else? The idea is for Professor Marichal to talk for about 30 minutes. I will let him know when he has 5 minutes in his time allotment, and then we will open the floor to questions and answers. As I have said before, this keynote talk uses the webinar function of the Zoom platform. So as a default, attendees cannot share with us their video and audio. However, for the question and answer session, those of you who prefer to for me to read your questions, I will read your questions, and for some, we might bring to the screen and share their video and audio. We do this because of the number of people registered. So thank you, and without much further ado, please, Carlos, thank you.
Well, hello, good morning. Here in Mexico, it's now 10 o'clock. I don't know where you are, but here it's rainy and a little bit cool. And even though I'm in Cuernavaca, which is rather tropical. In the first place, I wish to thank the organizers of the seminar for this invitation, Manuel, Miguel, Bernardo, Sergio, and Paula, and other colleagues involved. I am honored to be on a program which promotes increased knowledge and debate on financial history, and particularly since it was inaugurated by Richard Silla. What I have to say today is a reflection on the birth of Latin American banking, on which I have been working for a long time. But it has also been inspired by his work and that of colleagues who have worked on the financial revolutions in the US and other nations that were early leaders in the field. Are you hearing me correctly?
Yes, Carlos.
Very good. In this paper, we offer a general overview of how banks first developed in various important Latin American nations from the mid-19th century, with special emphasis on the larger domestic banks which forged close ties with local governments. This interpretation runs counter to the traditional views on the origins of banking in the region, the most common misconception being that in this early era of the birth of banks, British banks dominated Latin American finance and faced little competition from domestic banks. In fact, we argue that the situation was much more complex. My paper today focuses on the mid-19th century when approximately 100 banks were set up in some 8 Latin American countries. that is, in a quarter of a century. The majority of them were commercial, and a few were mortgage firms, but almost all of which adopted the form of a sociedad anónima, as joint stock companies are known in Spanish. This was something relatively new in Latin America, and it seems to me bespeaks not only the rise of banking, but also of capitalism itself from the mid-19th century in Latin America. But before going any further, I wish to make some general comments as to the question of why the history of banking in Latin America should be seen as a worthwhile and interesting subject to explore, and why it should be incorporated as a chapter of the vast international literature on banking history, which is focused mostly on the United States, Europe, Japan, etc. In this regard, I would point to three main reasons to look at the Latin American experience. The first has to do with the ways we understand economic development in the long run. Here, my argument is that while banking took a long time in developing in Latin America, and eventually all countries in the region acquired a modern banking system of different types and sizes, of course, in the 20th century or mid-20th century. In other words, while they were slow, the Latin American economies and nations eventually got there. Here, I think it is important to confront the success versus failure perspective, which is so common in many popular but superficial stories on economic development. And even in the perspective of much cited authors like Acemoglu and Robinson, who have contributed to theorizing on comparative development from a historical perspective. In this regard, I think it could be useful to consider other ways of looking at banking history in the long run and consider the utility of the way historians have approached the history of industrial revolutions, especially the suggestive approaches promoted by the idea of first comers, second comers, and third comers. I think that something like this scheme can be applied to banking history with variations, of course. In this sense, it might be argued that the first round of banking revolutions clearly took place in Europe and the United States, the financial revolutions of Richard Silla, but also that a second wave took place in the mid-19th century when banking systems developed and broadened for both in the first comers, but also began in other countries, the second comers. For instance, Spain or Italy are interesting examples. In Spain in the 1850s, some 30 banks, many of them regional banks, sprung up as demonstrated in the collective works promoted by Carlos Udria and Yolanda Martel. Furthermore, it may be noted that in Italy, almost 300 small and medium-sized banks were born between 1850 and 1873, as demonstrated by financial historian Alejandro Polsi, excellent work. At the same time, in other regions of the world, such as Latin America, there was also a burst of banks in ports and capital cities, although on a smaller scale. A second reason to do research on the Latin American experience is because there is now sufficient literature on it to be able to draw up some general trends of use for comparative financial history. I remit you to the webpage that Manuel has mentioned and which is mentioned in the paper, H. Bancaria. It has a lot of information there on the Latin American banking experience in historical perspective. The third reason to focus on Latin America, it seems to me, is that it can help to better understand key aspects of the economic history of this region and to explore how this can contribute to the many ongoing efforts to do global history. But let us begin at the beginning, which is with the independence of Latin America and why it was so difficult to initially establish banks. In Latin America, there were some curious and important previous experiments with banking before independence. In fact, there was a long colonial tradition in credit and finance stretching over almost 3 centuries, which is not well known in the English language. There's a lot written in Spanish on this. It was characterized by the institutional framework of ancien regimes or colonial regimes, rather similar to the credit arrangements in most of Catholic Europe. In Spanish America, commercial credit, mining credit, and church credit systems developed and were quite complex during those 3 centuries. Much of the old colonial credit system remained after independence, but much also crumbled. As you can see from my first diagram, after independence came the first experiments with banking, particularly in the Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City, and very briefly Peru and Bolivia. I suppose that you are seeing the diagram of PowerPoint 1. No?
You can see it now.
Okay, well, these are the early banking experiments after Latin America independence. And as you may see, the Banco de Brasil was the first bank in Latin America, and it lasted for 21 years. And then you have another small commercial bank which develops that in 1838 and continues later. In Argentina, the first bank was 1822, the Banco de Descuentos, changed its name to Banco Nacional when the government kind of took it over, and then closed in 1834 by Rosas, closed it and just used Casa de Moneda to print, to emit money, paper money. In Mexico, there was the Banco de Avío, which was a kind of an investment bank. And that lasted for about 10 or 11 years before folding. And in Bolivia and Peru, there were other banking experiments at the time, but all of them failed. Now, we could ask why they failed, and that would be an interesting subject to discuss at a later time. But today, I want to focus on the fact that between 1850 and 1873, approximately 100 banks were set up in some 8 Latin American countries, many of which lasted a long time, and some of which still exist. Now we have the second slide, and you can see from the slide that in this period there sprung up quite a number of domestic banks. In Argentina, about 12, Brazil 20, Chile 12, Colombia 10, Cuba 20, Peru 12, so forth. Mexico only 1, but that's the 1864. Including here, we have these British commercial banks like the Bank of London and Mexico and Peru, which was set up in 1864. But those were actually quite a few banks. I mean, quite few. There were only 6 of the British ones studied by Jocelyn. This comparison, between domestic and British banks runs counter to the traditional interpretation of Jocelyn and so forth, who had emphasized British banks in 1860s. Actually, there were mostly domestic banks set up at this time. There just hasn't been any comparative study of them before this. There are a lot of people working on the subject, but I wanted to do something comparative. The banking takeoff was clearly linked to a powerful long wave of international expansion of trade and finance, which gained strength from mid-century, launching an export boom in half a dozen Latin American nations. This is when, 1850, 1870, you have the first real export booms of the post-colonial period. At that time, you also some early flows of foreign credit and investment to the region, which denoted an initial process of internationalization of capital flows, albeit subject to fairly intense fluctuations and crises like those of 1857, 1866, and 1873, which all hit Latin America. Well, my argument, my main argument here is that however important early globalization was, there were also fundamental domestic economic and political dynamics which explain the rise of banking in several Latin American nations between 1850 and 1873. This cannot be understood without thoroughly examining the relationship in each country between the government and 1 or 2 major banks, which soon occupied a most influential place within the respective banking system. The preeminent role of the larger banks, which were much larger than the British overseas banks, was largely the result of the privileges granted them by the government. In some cases, the banks we referred to were actually called national, but not necessarily. They were for the most part privately owned, but frequently obtained important privileges regarding the issue of banknotes and the handling of fiscal and public debt accounts. Clearly, the privileges granted to banking firms with regards to the issue of banknotes provided economic power, since these banks controlled a large share of the currency in circulation. This jives with the interpretation of Steve Haber and Charles Calomiris in their excellent, relatively recent book, Fragile by Design, which deserves a broad readership in the region, in the Latin American region. They emphasize the importance of early bank contracts and the role of negotiations between early bankers and state elites. On the other hand, the large Latin American banks were not just instruments of power by small groups of influential entrepreneurs and politicians. They also were leading commercial enterprises and played an important role in the introduction of new banking practices within growing economies, as well as in facilitating new financial policies and innovations that promoted more efficient practices within the different economies, but also with regard to the financial and fiscal policies of state administrations in Latin American countries, which began to really modernize. In this paper, we focused particularly on the rise of banking in 4 country cases in the mid-century: Brazil, Cuba, Argentina, and Uruguay. I won't go into them in detail, but I'll give you a very brief synopsis. The main argument put forward is while there were particular reasons for the birth of banking in each of these countries, including specific political, economic, and social circumstance, there are also certain parallels that we think worthwhile developing in regards to the institutional framework and special role of the largest bank or banks in each country. So we're talking about an exercise in political economy in the early stages of development of Latin American banking. The first country with a fair number of commercial banks was Brazil. And this is interesting, not only because it had a fairly stable government and a large population, but also because it was heavily a slave economy. This seems to me an interesting circumstance, and we can debate this later, and also in regards to Cuba, which was also a successful slave export-oriented economy, which impelled the creation of a good number of early banks. Now, slavery and capitalism were not at loggerheads, as we know from the US South. As you can see from the diagram, the Banco do Brasil dominated the early banking scene in Rio. And this was so in part because it dominated the issue of banknotes or paper money. I really don't have time to go into the details, but you can see from the, wait a sec, back. You can see from the graph that the Banco do Brasil dominated the other little banks. I want to mention one thing. There's a very famous, not so famous, there's an important banking expert in Brazil at that time writing about banks. This is the time when the first books are written about banks in Latin America. And he noted in 1848, a little before the foundation of the Banco do Brasil, that Rio de Janeiro didn't have any bank in 1848, an important one, except the Banco Comercial. And he compared this with New York, and he says, why does New York City, which has a population somewhat larger than Rio, have 24 banks and we don't have but one? And why is it that in Rio de Janeiro province, there are no banks, and in New York State, there are already dozens? So he was conscious, and he later played an important role in the reform of the Brazilian banking system. He was conscious that there was a great contrast between Latin America and the US. Now, the Banco do Brasil is set up, it's merged with the Banco Comercial, it becomes the biggest bank, and then we see the other banks that are set up. But I want to pay attention to the Banco do Brasil and what happened in during the Paraguayan War. So we can go to the next slide. Up to the Paraguayan War, it was the Banco do Brasil that issued banknotes, basically. The government had been issuing some state issues in the past, but it was only in 1865 that it found it necessary to issue a lot of paper money to cover the expenses of the Paraguayan War. And what happened? It took away the privileges of the Banco do Brasil, and the state treasury began to be the main issuer of paper money. This continued until the end of the war, and then the state diminishes its issue, and the Banco do Brasil comes back in, and you can see this basically in the graph. After the war, the Banco do Brasil would again become a leader in issue of banknotes. But it would take a while. It was really in the 1880s that it came back with other banks, where we can now see the pie chart issue of banknotes by Banco do Brasil. And Manuel, let's see if we can go on to the next one. This is a chart based on Pedro Agote's study of 1887, comparing Argentina, Brazil, and Chile banking systems. And you can see that the issue of banknotes by the Banco do Brasil in 1887 dominates the whole system. It has 62%. And then there are a few other issuing banks. This is a demonstration of how a big bank dominated the banking system. And it was basically because of the reasons that Haber and Calomiris put out in their book, this dominance of the close relationship between a big bank and the government. And the reluctance to let lots of little banks be set up. There was a reluctance by the central government, which thought that this could create a very bad situation for the issue of money, Brazilian currency, which would not be respected internationally. So they wanted the Banco do Brasil to control it and to have a kind of gold standard to support the Brazilian currency. Well, if we move on to Argentina, which also developed banking quite early, we can note that there was also one big bank, the Banco de la Provincia de Buenos Aires, founded in 1854. It was the most successful bank that both handled accounts and provided finance for the government. But above all, it was the leading bank for all kinds of clients in the richest province, that of Buenos Aires, including hundreds and then thousands of ranchers, merchants, agriculturalists, early industrialists, and the first railroad. By the way, the Banco de la Provincia de Buenos Aires still exists. It's one of the big banks of Argentina. And it provides a very interesting example of this was a kind of a mixed bank, state and private. The graph shows data from De La Paulera study with Alan Taylor, Tensando el Ancla, which is also in Spanish, in English. And they do a good study. It demonstrates to you that there's a lot of information, statistical information about big banks in the 19th century. And this has not been very well studied. It now is beginning to be studied. Now there are several dozen studies on different particular countries or banks. And in the case of the Banco de la Provincia, it has the biggest archive in Latin America. It's huge. It has 3 underground stories of documentation and could provide an enormous number of research projects. I highly recommend it. It's the biggest archive, as far as I know, a banking archive in Latin America. Now, we'll go on to the 1880s with the next slide. In the 1880s, we can see that the Provincial Bank of Buenos Aires was still a major actor. But by then, another kind of state private bank, the National Bank, had come to dominate. And then we see a lot of other banks. And so we have really a system of plurality of emission, but dominated by a couple of big banks. It's very similar to the Brazilian case. Finally, in this paper, we look at Cuba, which has been well studied by Spanish scholar Inés Roldán, as well as a few other researchers. The first important commercial bank, the Banco Español de La Habana, was set up in 1856. In other words, the 1850s, in Brazil, Argentina, Cuba are clearly the leaders at this point. This bank, the Banco Español de La Habana, was set up in 1856 in the midst of a sugar and railroad boom and continued to be the largest bank in Cuba for many decades, despite the emergence of some 20 smaller rivals. It should be noted that this bank was basically set up with capital from Havana merchants. They're the stockholders. It's not a government bank, it's a private bank, but it has privileges. It issues money. So what happened? Well, it was the main issuer of money until 1878. Well, 68. But in 1868, a war breaks out in Cuba, a civil war, where Cuban rebels go against the Spanish government and try to get independence. This preceded the later Cuban War of Independence. But for 10 years, there was war in Cuba. And the Banco Español de La Habana then played a very curious role. It continued to issue money, had a basic actually almost a monopoly of issue of money. But the government needed to finance the war, the 10-year war. And so that the government then doesn't print the money itself. It asks the Banco Español to print the money for war as a war issue scheme. So this is a curious system where the Banco Español actually issues both the treasury bills, or money which was used for war expenses, but also continues to issue its own bank bills, basically for commercial clients and business. Now, this reflects the fact that this was a kind of a colonial bank, but it's not. I mean, it's privately owned. No? And there's some interesting parallels here with the Brazilian case in terms of the war and this shifting of money issue. There are many other interesting cases of early Latin American banks, but we don't have the time to go into them into detail into their history, although they all merit attention, study, and debate. Well, clearly, my talk is all too brief to encompass the complexity and diversity of this chapter of early Latin American banking history. But my paper has more information on this subject, and I think it could stimulate debate and hopefully more and better research, and maybe help to respond to the question of whether there was an early financial revolution in Latin America in the mid-19th century, or may I ask you, how can we describe this process? I don't have a definite answer to that. Well, this is where I am ending my talk, and many thanks for listening, and I hope you have some questions or observations.
Thank you so much, Carlos. As I have asked in the chat, kindly use the chat or the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you have questions for the speaker. Thank you. As a reminder, this session is using the webinar function. So by default, attendees can share their audio or video feeds unless we upgrade your credentials to panelists. We have a first question in the Q&A window. So I am going to read it aloud. Ulysses Pascal says, thank you for this interesting presentation. Can you elaborate on the comparative history of bank development and the periods of war? So I guess the question would be, what is the influence of wars in the countries you study and financial development, banking development in particular?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. But I mean, there's information in the paper on relating to the case of Brazil and the Paraguayan War. More work is needed on that case in the case of Argentina and Uruguay, which also participated in the Paraguayan War of 1865-70. The 1860s is a period of many wars in Latin America. That's one. We have wars in Mexico, where the French invade Mexico with. And the Bank of London and Mexico was set up during the Mexican invasion by France, and it was heavily involved with the Maximilian Empire. So there's a connection there, which hasn't been really studied. Of course, the archival material in Mexico is not good. In Argentina, there's great information, so a study could be done on that.
Thank you, Carlos. Yes, that could be the question for basically an encyclopedia of finance in South American banking history. The next question is by Sergio Castellanos Gamboa. So please, Sergio.
Carlos, thank you very much for this very enlightening presentation. I want to ask you in terms of thinking of a future research agenda, particularly why did you choose these 4 case studies, and what would you think could be the way to go in terms of a future research agenda, perhaps looking at more case studies or digging deeper into each country's financial history across time? Thank you very much.
Well, for research agendas, the first thing you have to do is to look at the international literature and see what are the interesting questions that have been raised. Now, the literature on Europe, the United States, and Japan is enormous, and their financial history historians have raised enormous numbers of questions. So I think that anyone who's looking at a research agenda should first look at that international literature and see what are the important questions. That's why I raised this issue of, you know, the birth of banking and the financial revolution. That's a very general and interesting problem. But it would be interesting to look at other questions raised by that literature, because the people who have been doing that in England, France, Germany, Italy, the United States, so forth, have raised and gone into have raised the key questions and gone into the sources. So I think the first thing to do is to see how your research project could be used in connection with other more developed research projects. The second thing is to keep into account the limitations so far of research in Latin America in terms of sources. You actually have to go and look them up, explore them. I remember when I went to the Banco de Brasil, the Centro de Cultura, around 1992, I went there to see what was there. There's a great archive of the Banco de Brasil. It's not easy to access because it's mostly not online. And you have to go up to the archive and to where they have the archive and discuss with the people there, so that they lend you the stuff. In the Banco de la Provincia de Buenos Aires, there's no problem there, and very few people use it. I mean, actually, quite a lot of people that have used it, but I don't think that the international scholars are aware that there's an enormous trove of information there, not just on banking history, on agricultural questions, and ranching questions and government public finance questions. And it runs for, you know, the archive begins in 1824, and then goes on. It has the oldest of the archives. Banco de la Nación in Buenos Aires has an archive also in the numismatic section of the bank, and you have to ask for the papers. Very few people have looked at this information, but there are some. Regalsky has looked at that at length. And then in Mexico, you have the archive, the historical archive of the Banco Nacional de Mexico. So you have to look at what archives are good in order to see where you could get good information, and compare that with the questions.
Thank you, Carlos. Next in the queue are Juan Flores and then Mary Bridges.
Hi, Carlos. No, I was thinking about all this literature on financial revolutions, and there is something that they insist on with the concept of financial revolution, and it's the levels of interest rates and the amount of credit. And I wondered whether we have some kind of qualitative or quantitative evidence in that period. And the other part regarding the evolution of credit, I was wondering whether you know, the creation of these institutions, as I kind of understood from your talk and your paper, is that they actually benefited a few sectors and also only a few people, right? So like the big producers. So I wonder whether we could eventually think or deduce that, you know, credit and the access to those institutions was actually quite restricted or continue to be restricted. Thanks.
Okay, should I answer that or should I go on?
We can pick a question by Mary, and then you can answer them both. Thank you.
Oh, that's good. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great, because mine is a little bit related. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about information practices among the banks, if there are generalizations that you see, particularly related to the way they process credit and look for security. I was wondering two aspects of that, about whether Naomi Lamoureux's kind of insider lending model of the kind of lending to directors applies, and also how they were seen versus British banks. What I understand is British banks are relatively reluctant to lend against fixed assets and such as real estate. So how would you kind of, how do they situate their own credit evaluation, security evaluation practices?
Okay, well, let's go with those two questions. The first one that Juan raises very interesting on interest rates. Well, that's the least studied of the questions in Latin American economic history of the 19th century. Just like banking history has been very late in being developed. You know, most Latin American economic history has been on foreign trade, on on agriculture and ranching and mining and some early industries and so forth, and very little bit on banking. But in the last 20 years, there are quite a lot of people. Now, I've written this book, which is going to come out soon in the Colegio de México, kind of giving an overview, but it only goes up to the late 1870s. And the purpose is to show that there's a lot of literature on the subject now. So it's a good field to look at, but it has to be developed. And in terms of interest rates, you can get from different particular studies, see that the very high interest rates until the 1850s. When the banks come on, the interest rates drop from 12 to 18% average, let's say, to about 6 to 10% a year on just normal commercial credits. No? So there's a big drop when banks come in. And that, I think, is very significant. It's a theme that should be looked at, because it obviously would improve the overall economic performance if you have a cheaper credit. And mortgage credits come in. And mortgage credit becomes very important, but practically nobody's worked on the mortgage credit except for Luis Felipe Segarra in Peru. And then there are old studies. There are in Argentina, there are old studies on mortgage credit, very voluminous studies, which can be, and the archives are rather good on the mortgage banks. Although Segarra has looked more at notaries, because we have to see that most mortgage credit is actually being extended privately and not through banks. But from 1870s on, in Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay, there's a big mortgage bank credit system being done through banks, which still exist. I mean, they're still the biggest mortgage banks, the ones that come down from the late 19th century. And Chile has something similar. So interest rates is a great subject to look at. I just think that it needs a lot of work, and it would need, meetings and research and seminars. Credit by how restricted was it? Juan asked about this, and actually, what we should say is this: the first banks are, in terms of comparisons, small banks. No, they're small in relation to the overall economy. They're located in the capital city and the ports. There are very few banks in the towns, local towns. The regional banks come in around 1880s, 90s, no? And particularly the 20th century. So it's rather concentrated in capitals and ports usually, and they are rather small, except those that I mentioned: the Banco del Brasil, Banco de la Provincia, Banco Español. Those are larger banks. They can be compared with big banks. Banco de la Provincia de Buenos Aires can be compared with any international bank at that time. No, one author, Agote, says it's bigger in terms of its assets and than the biggest German banks. No? Of course, they dominated the richest province in Buenos Aires in the Buenos Aires province had a growth rate which was equivalent to Ohio, Kansas, any other place. The rest of Argentina is not the same, but so that's a very big bank. And it provides a lot of credit to a lot of people, but the other ones have restricted circles. And this relates to what Mary has said, which is the issue of information practice and credit, and whether we have a lot of lending, insider lending. Well, let's take, I can't answer on all cases, but one example, which corresponds to Lamoureux, more or less. The Banco Nacional de México, very good information on the 1880s. The directors of that bank did do a lot of insider lending. And you can see it in the correspondence. And the archive is sufficiently good that you can look into it and get all the information that you want. Noel Maurer has done work on that, and he has a whole series of theses about that. But it needs to be worked out more on a nitty-gritty level. You know, what directors were lending money or authorizing loans, credits, and whether it was going to their companies or not. And British banks, that's an interesting question. Well, Jocelyn worked on it. Jeffrey Jones just continued a little bit on Jocelyn, but nobody has worked except Charles Jones. Charles Jones worked very well on British banks in Argentina. And it's interesting that his thesis came out around 1974, never got circulation, wasn't published, but it has been translated just last year into Spanish in Buenos Aires. Now, if you ask Jones, he'll probably send you a copy of his thesis. I have a Xerox copy, but it was very good, and it's the best study on bank lending. But for the other British banks, haven't seen, nitty-gritty studies where you can really find out what they were doing. You can derive a lot of stuff from Jocelyn, but since Jocelyn, there hasn't been a great amount of work, no, except for Jones. No? I'm being a little too drastic on that because there are some specific studies. So insider lending was important.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Mary, for asking your questions. So next I am going to read very succinctly the questions by Rohan Advani and Iliana Quintanar. Rohan Advani asked, what was the importance of domestic banks to Latin American business groups and national economic development? And then Iliana Quintanar, was the Banco do Brasil behaving as a government bank, given that it could issue paper monies? How were these paper monies backed? Ask Sebastian and Gail Trainer to ask their questions themselves. Thank you.
Should I answer or should Sebastian go?
Yes, you can ask your question. You can answer the two questions. Thank you.
Well, the first question about domestic banks and it's important for economic development, I would say this. On most studies of economic history in Latin America, banks are left out. Why is that? Because I don't know, except that it's late. It's a late developer, the banking history in Latin America. Now there are studies, and it's interesting, but it's very difficult to make an argument saying that banks developed such and such a sector. They were important in all sectors, as soon as they got going. So it seems to me that banking history is necessary to understand Latin American economic development, capitalism in short. And if you don't have banks, you really don't have capitalism in a modern sense. And that seems to me curious that they're left out of most economic histories. I mean, and you can see that in the study by Beaumont Thomas or by Ocampo and Bertola. We've had discussions on this. Financial history is basically left out. So that's a kind of a problem in Latin American economic history. And I argue that it has to be introduced. It has to be, I don't know if it's the center, but it has to be a very important part of economic history in Latin America to understand development. Then the other question was about Brazilian Banco do Brasil as a government bank. Well, that has been worked recently by Vilela in a very good book, which has just come out, published by Fundación, I think. I'm not sure if it's Fundación Getulio Vargas, and also by Thiago Gambi, who's done a book on the on the Banco do Brasil as a kind of an instrument of the Brazilian government and oligarchy. Vilela says Banco Brasil goes along with government policy basically, and a lot of Brazilian landowners were not too much in favor of a very strict money issue policy. Those are two books which can help resolve some of the questions raised by Iliana. I can't go into them in any detail. Why don't we go on?
Thank you, Carlos. So next in the queue are Sebastián Álvarez and then Gail Trainer, and then I will read two questions by Juan Odicio and Bruno Aidar, but you can answer both Sebastián's and Gail's.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carlos, for this great talk. I have a question that kind of revolves in this discussion between the importance of the banking sector for economic development in Latin America, and try to push a little bit forward. And I want to ask you if you think there may be a national or foreign divide in terms of the role of the banks in what they are founding. Let's say national banks founding mainly states at different levels, and foreign banks with a more important role on economic activity. And also, I wanted to ask, to what extent did domestic banks, domestic Latin American bank, intermediating foreign capital when you look at the at the arrival of international capital flow into the countries?
Well, I'll answer that quickly.
We can have Gail's question first,
Okay,
and then
Gail.
yes, thank you. Gail, you can start sharing your video feed and your audio if you are able to. Thank you. We can hear you now.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks an awful lot, Carlos, for this really great paper. I really liked it. I have kind of a more detailed question in that I'm wondering, you allude to the funding side of bank activities quite a lot as you go through the paper, but I'm kind of wondering if you can distill some comparative conclusions about the liability side of bank balance sheets in Latin America. In particular, I'm thinking about the issues of raising deposits, the sort of obligations that are obligations and stability that are incurred by bank note issuance, the issues of funding mortgage portfolios, and sort of very broadly, sort of asset liability matching, issues about matching assets and liabilities. Because these are, of course, questions that fundamentally affected both the activities and the viability of the banking institution. So I'm kind of wondering what comparative conclusions that you might make about that side of the balance sheet. So thanks a lot.
Well, a question by Sebastian on the banking sector. There's a traditional view that the foreign banks were more involved in foreign trade finance and had more relations with the exporters and importers. That's a traditional view, and it can be held up in many ways. Now, Gail has worked on that, and several other people have worked on that subject. And I think that generally speaking, British banks were in that sense cautious. They linked up mainly with the biggest exporters. Many of them were British, but not necessarily, and with the big import houses. So there was a very close relationship for quite a long while. Now, as Gail has demonstrated, in Brazil, after 1905 or so, the foreign banks, British banks in particular, lose certain importance versus the domestic banks. Domestic banks are also very heavily involved in international trade finance, but they didn't begin that way necessarily. They allowed the foreign banks to take up, but they had more expertise in the field. So the foreign banks should be studied at length. I would say that, it's not necessary just to focus on British banks. There were also French-owned banks, and there were German banks. And the German banks have very good archives, particularly the Deutsche Bank. And it would be good to look at that, to compare the French and the German. There have been a couple of studies, but they're not a great number. And to see the Germans are very heavy on links with the German importers and exporters and with the German companies that move in. They're very close relationships, and they maintain them until the First World War, and then they lose their properties. They come back a bit afterwards. But anyway, that's a very important topic, and I would just focus on the fact that it's not just British banks that should be looked at. As to domestic banks being important in terms of foreign capital and intermediating, and bringing in foreign capital. Well, I would say this: in the country I've studied most on that subject is Argentina, and there it's domestic merchant banks that are key. The merchant banks are family owned or group owned, like the Tornquist Group or the Bamberg Group or several other, Portalis Group, and they brought in a lot of foreign capital. They were the agents of many European merchant banks. I'm talking about the 1880s, 1890s, and then goes on till about 1930s. The big domestic banks, commercial banks, had relationships, but those haven't been studied much. The mortgage banks, on the other hand, in the case of Argentina or Uruguay, were very interesting because they're very heavily involved in placing mortgage bonds as cédulas. They take the German example, and they place them abroad, and it works very well until the 1890s, and then it all collapses. But then after 1900, the land property was going up so fast in Argentina and Uruguay that mortgage bonds were very attractive to European investors, and they're sold basically in Belgium and Holland and France, and some in Germany. But they're very, very important securities that go on until the Great Depression. They continue to be sold on a large scale in Europe. And looking at those mortgage banks would be very interesting. As far as what Gail is raising, she's raising complex questions, difficult questions, a banking history question.
That's my job.
That's right. And that's why her book on Brazilian banking is probably the best one to look at banking. But she focuses most on the 20th century. I'm looking at the 19th century. She has more information on bank balances. That we have bank balances for the 19th century, but they're worse. No, they're not so good. They're not so detailed, and people haven't been looking at them in sufficient depth. And so it's difficult to answer those questions. As far as money issue, for instance, the 1880s, in the case of Argentina, all these banks are issuing money. And in Mexico also, there was plurality of issue. So you have enormous amounts of issue of money by different types of banks. In the Argentine case, there was state banks, regional state banks. And there was a lot of insider lending, but because the politicians and the entrepreneurs in places like Tucumán and Córdoba and so forth were very closely linked up. And they were issuing money for basically to finance all kinds of activities of these entrepreneur politicians. You know? In the Mexican case, actually, it's quite similar. The regional banks are set up, 23 of them, and from 1880 on. And they also do a lot of local financing of the specific economic group that's owns the bank, no? Like Kriel in Chihuahua. But there isn't sufficient information yet, and there hasn't been sufficient research on the question to be able to answer some of those questions. Mario Cerruti and I put a book together on regional banks in Mexico, but it's just a first approach. There are 8 essays by 8 people who've done an interesting first approach, but I think we need a lot more research on specific banks and to get into all the details there. And as far as some of the other banks, well, yes, in the case of Banco Nacional de Mexico, maybe it would be possible to answer your question if we had more time, and perhaps Banco de la Provincia. But for now, I'll leave it at that. I say that there's a lot of research that has to be done, and the questions raised by Gail and other people internationally are the ones that should orient people who are going into Latin American banking now. To raise the questions and say, what can we find?
Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Sebastian. So I am going to read Juan Odicio's question, and then Bruno is going to make a question, and then for reasons of time, we will start wrapping up after those 2 questions. So Juan Odicio says hello and thanks you, Carlos, for the presentation as always. He was wondering if any of the monetary discussions in advanced countries had any influence on the institutionalization of these early banking systems, or whether you think it was more the result of practical needs of both governments and companies. And then Bruno will ask the question himself. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And watch Carlos Marichal presentation. Thanks so much for the large comparative perspective. I'm very glad to see Brazil integrated into a Latin American perspective. I wonder if in the long run, the success of these banks of Brazil, Argentina, and Cuba were closely related to ability of the foreign trade in great commodities, was coffee, sugar, hide and meat. Just can explain the lateness of Mexican bank development compared to this case? Thank you.
Well, in terms of the first question by Juan Odicio, that is not in my paper here. I did it in another paper, and it's in chapter 4, I think, of this upcoming book, which I will send to people in PDF at some point. It's kind of in press with proofs and so forth, so I can't send it now. But I could send you the other essay, and it's about this question of free banking versus monopoly of issue debates in the mid-century. And we did this with Fernando Artiago, who's now at Pennsylvania, and we worked on this. And the debates in the 1850s, 60s are very intense in Latin America. And they all take off from the debates in Great Britain in the 1840s on, you know, the debate about the Bank of England and what should be the rules for issue of money. And so they're all citing the British debates, the parliamentary debates, and all the major discussions there. So they're very aware of that. They're also looking at the French example, the Banque de France, which has a kind of a monopoly of issue, partial, but dominant, no? And they're very interested in that also. Those two examples are the major ones for the mid-century. But in the 1880s, there are lots of references to the national bank system in the United States. And Argentina kind of copied it in some ways, but it's never a perfect copy. They're always adapting, no? So all studies of monetary policy have to be aware that, yes, Latin American financial experts and politicians who were involved in the monetary debates looked abroad. And but the literature on that is not sufficiently studied. I mean, there are lots of interesting books, financial classics of Latin America. They're available, and people should look at them. Hathi Trust has a lot of this stuff, no? But people haven't really gone into it, no? And studied the texts, the financial texts and monetary texts of the 19th century. A few people have studied them. Ricardo Salis has done this for Mexico. No? And then Bruno, well, Argentina, Brazil, Cuba versus Mexico, and why Mexico was late in developing its bank system. Well, yes, Mexico had a less dynamic export economy until the 1880s. In the 1880s, it kind of takes off and all these banks appear. So there must be a connection there. But it wasn't. These first banks were not so heavily involved in the export business. It was mainly the domestic economy and the state public finance side that absorbed much of the attention of the biggest bank, Banco de Nacional de Mexico. Banco de Londres was involved in the export trade and finance, but I wouldn't say it was more important than its domestic trade. Domestic business. No? Banco de Londres basically becomes a Barceloneta operation, financing the first industrial textile mills and a lot of domestic activity. But it's a difficult question to answer. You know, I posed that question in different places. Why is Mexico late in the development of its banking compared to Argentina, Brazil, and Cuba? It's a very interesting question. I think somebody could go at and look at that in greater depth.
Thank you, Carlos. So I'm going to make use of my prerogative as a chair, and I'm going to ask you sort of a reflection question that might help us close the session. And the question has to do as to why there is sort of a blind spot that does not incorporate Latin America into accounts of the global history of finance. Mexico might have been delayed in its banking development. However, we know that Mexico was providing hard money and reserve assets in the form of Mexican silver dollars to European financial markets and North American investment bankers. And those silver dollars were were still being critical for the conduction of trade between Europe, North America, and Asia. So I guess the bigger point is how can we best write transnational, global or comparative financial history of the region in the context of the preeminence of Anglo-American financial capitalism, which is sort of a mirror of Anglo-American empire relations.
Well, I would be in agreement with the affirmation about blind spots. There are lots of blind spots in economic history internationally. Now, when we go into global history, what happens? Well, historians from Germany, France, US, Canada, Great Britain tend to take the lead because they have more information, they have more research, longer research traditions, there are more journals, there are more monographs, there are more doctoral theses on their subjects. Also because the studies on things like British merchant banks are excellent and provide a view of what was happening internationally, but also because the British merchant banks were taking the lead in globalization in terms of trade. No? Now, if you look at the papers of Rothschild or Baring or so forth, in the 1840s and 1850s, they were very well aware of what was happening in Latin America because they had all kinds of correspondence. Miguel López Morel has looked at this in great detail. And so they didn't have any blind spots because they had clients all over the world, you know? And they were very well aware of this. But banking historians sometimes who are focused on later periods or on other types of banks don't pay much attention to Latin America frequently. Now that's a subject which I think merits a discussion in the future, both from the subjects that you're working on and which are clearing up things, Manuel, on terms of monetary questions and the multiple monetary issues. I think that right now we're at an edge of the takeoff of banking and monetary history of Latin America. And I think that there are a lot of people who are working in the field. And I think that at some point we could send off some of the bibliography. No? In the recent book I have about 45 pages of the bibliography and mostly recent studies. There it's mostly in Spanish, but there's a lot in English too, some in French. Now, there I would say that the important thing is for, as you say, Anglo-American economic historians to also look at the Spanish language literature, which is now quite rich. I would say that 20 years or 30 years ago, that people like David Brading and others would look at the literature. And now a lot of economic historians don't even look at the literature, but it's frequently because they don't know it, they're not familiar with it, or their libraries don't buy it. No, you know, Latin America is publishing lots of stuff, and it's difficult to be, I think, selective if you're in a library in England or in Canada, know what would be good to buy. No, and then economic historians would have more information if they knew, if they had a little guidance. So I think economic historians have to help librarians find out what is being published and get it into the circuit of the English language journals and so forth.
Thank you, Carlos, for your magnificent talk. And I am sure that our colleagues and I are very appreciative of you participating as our second keynote speaker. And we truly appreciate your support to this initiative. And I have shared in the chat a link to H Bancaria, which is an amazing portal with sources, bibliographies, and a number of people who are working, researchers, professors, and students who are working on financial history, and particularly the banking history of the region. So without much further ado, I am going to thank you, Carlos, for your presentation, and to all of our audience. This chat will be published in the YouTube channel, and we thank you all for coming today. And we will stop recording now, and we can stay a little bit for conversation. But thank you all.